guys. I was in a group with Bill and Alicia, and it would actually be great. I don't know if Alicia's back in the main room.
I'm here.
Hi. Since I think our small group stopped kind of in the middle of your thoughts. So I would love if you could share your thoughts on why your role specifically is unique at your district.
So I think my role is unique, I think, because this partnership work and the SGS work isn't the only work I lead. I oversee all of our nursing and health services department, guidance and counseling, expulsions, transfers, affidavits, enrollment, a lot of different things. But I also oversee all of the choice work. So this work does fit perfectly in my lane. I was thinking about if the work would continue if something happened to me. And I'm just a year one SGS district, but I think having, creating that portfolio planning process where it's just it's systematized and it's, something we do annually, figuring out how every other division fits in this work. And I think when I got cut off, I was sharing that, opportunity culture is something that through a portfolio planning process, you see where staffing shortages are. And you also align that with, school performance. So that process has helped us to see where we might need to implement opportunity culture because of a staffing shortage. My challenge right now is just making sure that this work is relevant to other departments across the district. And I think when something is meaningful to others, the work will continue. So creating a system and a process that others can just put their work in terms of annual evaluation, the portfolio planning and those things. As long as I'm here, the work's relevant to me because it's my job. But for everyone else in the district, make it meaningful to them as well, and to see how they can use the vehicle to help accomplish their goals, I think is important. And it's a challenge at the same time because this is new work for us.
Chris, could we go to the next slide? Yeah, and so when we're thinking about succession planning as a concept, really what comes to mind is lever 4, which focuses specifically on the sustainability of this work. Bill in our breakout group has a succession plan now, which is pretty impressive because usually when we start this conversation, 100% of people do not have a plan. But he was sharing that for him, it's a critical practice because the work is not interrupted. There's no risk of the work being interrupted. If you have a really clear succession plan in place. Chris, could we go to the next slide? Yeah. And so part of this is not just sort of, what happens to the tasks that you're responsible for, what happens to the things that you're responsible for if you do leave. It's also a question of, do you have the level of talent at your district now that would ensure that the work not only continues, but that it continues well. All right, Chris, could we go to the next slide? Okay, so I'm going to drop into the chat 2 separate diagnostics, and one is for, I'll indicate, who should take which. So CIOs, CIO equivalents. This is your diagnostic, the one that's first in the chat. And then superintendents, here is yours. There you go. And let's take 5 to 7 minutes to take the diagnostic. All right, let's come back together. And before we talk about the results of our diagnostics, Adam's going to talk a little bit about, the challenges of unplanned leadership transitions.
Thanks, Freddie. And again, I think that we frame these here in the context of a CIO, but this is applicable, really for any role, any senior role. And we've seen a number of challenges with unplanned transitions across the board. First and foremost, one thing that people don't realize is that succession planning is as much a talent development strategy as it is sort of risk mitigation. And so, in the absence of proactive succession planning, you don't always give other people on the team the opportunity to learn and practice the skills necessary to step into the role. It's clear what that could mean in the context of CIO. It could be participating in things with TEA, coming to professional development, engaging in certain ways with partners, participating in, coming to a meeting with the cabinet or the senior leadership team, engaging in preparation for board meetings, all the kinds of things that if you are in the seat, in the CIO role, you need to own, but you don't necessarily get exposure to if you're someone who reports to the CIO, unless either the circumstance just requires it, or the CIO takes a really intentional perspective on talent development. And so what happens in the absence of proactive development is usually one of two things. Either the organization goes outside to find somebody, and national searches, regional searches, whatever you might think of, like an external search, generally speaking, is an expensive and time-consuming process. And it is often difficult to get an external candidate who has the right combination of knowledge, skills, mindset, and experiences, because you are almost necessarily needing to poach somebody from another district, and that's easier said than done. I think that overall, the key thing here is the threat to the work. If there is a need to hit pause, you have a transition in leadership, you're not sure who's going to be in charge, things of that nature, you can create an air pocket in which it isn't clear who's leading and what's happening. And often in the context of a bureaucracy in particular, in the absence of clear ownership, clear leadership, things just grind to a halt. And if there's one thing that can't work with SGS, it's getting off the annual cycle. It's critical to be able to stay on the annual cycle of planning, QSA, portfolio planning, call for quality schools, school actions, and so forth. You can't afford to pause that for 3 months, because you can't pause the school year. You can't pause the accountability clock. And so the key thing is to do this planning in advance so that you don't have to hold things up on the back end.
Chris, could we go to the next slide? Okay, so we're going to go back into breakout discussions. And one note is that all of these questions are geared towards CIOs or CIO equivalents. So I'm going to add back into the chat the superintendent facing diagnostics, so that if you're not a CIO, you have the questions that are applicable to you. And this is a judgment-free zone. The intention here is not to say that you should have done any of these things. This is to get you thinking about the steps that you can take to help the work that you are responsible for, that your CIO is responsible for, to help all of that become sustainable and ongoing. And so the idea here is to just candidly share which practices you currently have in place and which you do not, and what that has you thinking about as you look at these questions. So we'll take 5 minutes for that discussion. Okay, so just to review the questions from the diagnostic. So again, all of this is intended not just to apply to CIOs. This really all applies to senior leadership across your district. The reason we're highlighting CIOs is obviously because the role in the context of SGS in particular is so unique and requires a more thoughtful transition. But we're going to actually go ahead and just talk through some of the best practices related to succession planning. And oh, I see from Chris, we're waiting on a couple of groups. I'll hang tight.
I would like to give a shout out. Elise, who is, I just learned, retiring from Midland, has done tremendous work to set her team up for success with not only a formal succession planning process, but also a lot of thoughtful efforts over time to get the team involved in the work from every angle so as to support sustainability in leadership. And I was thinking, Melissa, I think you're here, but I was thinking when you said that, like, y'all do generally like roll deeper at the PD events. And I always think that makes sense because partially it's just bias. Like that's what I always did when I was in particular at the Department of Education. Like people would be annoyed that I would bring like 3 of my deputies, but I was like, I want them to all hear this directly. I want them to be able to participate. And, hopefully they'll stick around here longer than I will. So please give Elise congratulations across, for all the reasons, including doing a really good job of setting y'all up for success after her departure.
I will. I'll share her kind words with you. Thanks, Adam.
Chris, do we have everybody back in the main room?
Yes, we're all back.
Okay, great. So when we're thinking about succession planning, we mean there are basically 2 big portions, the most important portions of a succession plan. And the first is an emergency succession plan. And it's a little bit broader than just an emergency. What we really mean is an unplanned transition. So if for any reason someone has to leave their role for either a short period of time or permanently, if it's something that the district has not planned for, then it would fall under this bucket. And that for an emergency succession plan, all we mean is that there is somebody who could move into the role on either an interim basis or even a permanent basis. That's something obviously that you can decide in real time. But an emergency succession plan outlines specifically who would step into the role and what they would be responsible for. And then looking at that person's role, the person who has stepped into the role, what happens to all of the things that they were responsible for previously? What do they continue to oversee, and what would they then delegate to somebody else? So it's not just how does this impact the CIO role, but how does this impact the work of the person who then takes on that work in an emergency situation? And then the second big portion of a succession plan is a gradual plan, a gradual transition. So this is an instance in which somebody gives plenty of notice to the district, and they've had ongoing conversation with both the superintendent and whoever else needs to be part of the conversation, so that it's not an immediate transition. It's something that happens gradually, and they're able to, over a longer term, expose whoever's going to step into their role to their various areas of responsibility. And we would consider it a gradual transition if it's something that happens even over the course of a year. So we're thinking over a much longer period than I think often folks would think about. Chris, could we go to the next slide? So when we're talking about succession planning, and Bill and I talked about this in the first breakout group a little bit, really, this is a talent development strategy above all things. So it's an opportunity to look internally and ask yourself, is there somebody who could reasonably step into my job with, enough development, with enough exposure to my work? And it also raises the opportunity to say, if that talent doesn't exist, then what are you going to do? Are you going to hire somebody externally? Is there someone on another team who could move onto your team and have exposure to your work and get some development so that you do have that pipeline in place? So it's really a cyclical opportunity to take a look at your internal pipeline and make any changes you need to make so that you have confidence in the folks that are, on your team in the long run. So one thing that we think a lot about is what are the things, and this is speaking to CIOs, what are the things that you're overseeing right now that you don't need to oversee? And whenever whenever Adam and I are talking to folks about their own succession plans, there are always things that somebody is overseeing that they don't need to oversee, and it's making their job more difficult. But more importantly, it means that somebody on their team isn't having basically professional development opportunities that could really strengthen your internal pipeline. So it's kind of a dual thing of really making your job easier and also strengthening the talent that's on your team. Adam, I saw, yeah, go ahead and jump in.
Oh, next one, sorry.
And then when we're thinking about succession planning, this is not a one-off activity. So we think about it as really, it falls really into the same category as like performance evaluations. This is something that should happen habitually over the course of someone's tenure from the beginning to the end. So on an annual, at least basis, you're taking the opportunity to look internally at your talent, think about how your job has changed over the last year. So, one thing we've noticed is that after we do an initial round of succession planning with someone and we come back a year later to facilitate that conversation, the question of how has your job changed, the answer is always in a million different ways. No one's job is stagnant. And so that's part of why it's important for this to be a habitual cyclical process, so that you always have a current understanding of what your job actually looks like, and so consequently how that would impact the person who would for any reason step into your job.
I think something that I'd add here is that this notion of it being an ongoing process from the beginning to the end of your tenure, like that might sound crazy or like that's just a throwaway comment, but we mean it literally. Like,
Yes.
it is difficult to know what's going to come down the road in a year or 2 years. And if we posit that the responsible plan is a plan that looks out at least a year in advance, the easiest way to know that you have that plan is to start from day one and keep it sort of current over time. I personally have left, two senior governmental roles and had different levels of success in terms of what the handoff looked like to my to my successors. And I think that you're more likely to succeed if you operate from the beginning with the mentality about what happens after you're gone and who comes behind you. Because if you operate with that mentality from the beginning, you have a lot of opportunities to make the right decisions on role design, make the right decision on, sort of assignment of responsibilities. And it can be, I think there's a lot of reasons why people don't do this. I think it can be perhaps a little bit morbid to think about, the end from the beginning, but it is a much more effective strategy as compared to waiting until, you're some number of years into the role and you have either a very time sensitive reason to leave, or you just have a desire to leave and you're starting to think about it. You'd be better off if you had started the planning from the very beginning.
Yeah, and just to make it more concrete, let's take an example district. Let's say that your district has done a significant amount of enrollment work over the last year, and the CIO is the person who has led that work. On year 3 of that enrollment system, there is someone on your team probably who can lead that work because it's established. The CIO's design process is finished. And so now you're more at a position of maintaining the system and making gradual improvements over time. And so it's not just thinking about the end, it's thinking about how has your job changed and what can I delegate now, or what can I really empower somebody with now, so that what I'm responsible for is responsive to what I need to be responsible for right now. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And yeah, let's actually pause there because we just shared a lot of information. So any questions or thoughts at this point? Does this have anybody thinking about their own position? And you can also share in the chat, obviously. Okay, let's keep going.
Great.
Yeah. Oh, sorry,
So,
Adam.
no, it's great. So we have succession planning broken down into a few different steps, and I'm going to walk through the first two of them. And we have some associated tools and templates for all of this, but this is a process that we've gone through with probably maybe like a dozen organizations so far, and it's gone pretty well and actually pretty quickly. So step one, you have to get started, and I think that the key thing here is that it's important to get very clear on what are the roles and responsibilities of all parties regarding succession planning. I think that often in the context of, you have a superintendent, you have a CIO, and perhaps you also have a talent or HR function. And between the three parties, it might be unclear who's supposed to be doing what in terms of succession planning. Perhaps the CIO is waiting for her or his superintendent to give them some direction. Perhaps the superintendent feels like that's really something that the HR or talent function should be doing with the chiefs. Whatever it may be, it's not something that gets done when everybody is waiting for somebody else to take the lead. And so having a really clear conversation about who owns what in the district for succession planning is an important step. This is one where ideally the superintendent is leading and saying, this is my vision. This is what I expect in my district. And ideally, this isn't something that applies only to the chief innovation officer. I think the superintendent, she or he ought to be thinking about this for all of their critical roles in the district. And that's not just chiefs, that's anybody who plays, kind of a specific, unique role that would be hard to replace in real time, which is to say most roles in the, the modern district central office. So that's one, roles and responsibilities. Two, as we've said many, many times, this notion of this cycle, just like SGS is, an annual cycle, and part of when SGS works best is when you make this cycle of analysis, reflection, and action predictable and consistent. You make it sort of like muscle memory. You need to do the same thing with the succession planning work. As Freddie said earlier, that could be tied into some type of performance evaluation or performance management approach. That's definitely true. There should certainly be some type of annual cycle where you are taking stock of the role. How has the role changed? If we had to hire for the role today, like what are the knowledge, skills, and mindsets needed? Understanding perhaps how the individual is doing relative to that role. Then importantly, understanding, especially within the organization, who are the people who are showing the combination of like skill and will that they could step into the role. And you need to agree to this on a real calendar basis. Put it on your calendar, put the quarterly or semi-annual, whatever it may be, put it on your calendar and commit to doing it. Otherwise, it's very easy for this just to get crowded out by all of the urgent, quasi-important tasks that make up the life of a senior leader in a school district.
Yeah,
Next.
and I would just add on to that. I think because this is it would fall into the quadrant of like very important but not urgent. You could always say that this is not urgent. I would consider tacking this particular task onto something that that your district is going to do cyclically, so like on a very regular basis. So I would consider working with your HR department to attach this particular process to, let's say, like we said before, performance evaluations, if you know for sure that your district is going to go through that process. Otherwise, it's this sort of amorphous thing that, it's really easy to continue to put it off. And then, you are far down the road and you don't have a plan for, how your role and the work that you're responsible for is going to, persist over time.
Next slide, please. Then step two, and I'm curious if anyone has any reactions to this, but we didn't start out with this process having be step two, doing an emergency succession plan. We got here in part because, just over time working with organizations, we found that the longer term gradual planning, people have so many reasons why they don't want to engage in it. And I think part of it is like the morbidity. They don't want to talk about losing their key people. They don't want to talk about the reasons why they might leave, so on and so forth. So we found that if we just got people to say, okay, whatever, enough about that. Like, imagine you got, you imagine you won the lottery. Imagine you got hit by the milk truck, as I've learned that Elise in Midland said. Let's just like put yourself in that thought experiment place. Then let's do an emergency succession plan. And by doing the emergency succession plan, you do surface a number of the key questions and key conversations that you need for the real succession planning. And just in our experience, people are much less likely to put up defensive barriers. Also, you can knock out the emergency succession planning in like a couple of hours potentially. I think probably we did one in like 90 minutes.
Yeah, you can do it in 90 minutes.
They had done pre-work and everything. But it's not it's not as hard psychologically, and it doesn't ask people to like wrestle with these existential questions about their own career. Everybody can imagine, they won the lottery and they've decided to retire. And so what's going to happen with their work?
Yeah, we have definitely found that really starting with the emergency succession plan makes it, really it's that folks avoid the longer term succession planning conversation a little bit because it's awkward. People don't want to say, oh, this is how long I want to stay in my job. Here's even a time frame. And then the other part too, which Adam alluded to, is that often, folks don't want to even think about losing their key leaders because it's really hard to think about, and so like all the more reason to put it off. Chris, could we go to the next slide? So these are some talent practices that we've found make this doable. And the ones that I want to highlight are understanding the strategic priorities, strengths and weaknesses of the district. And the reason I want to highlight that one in particular is because that changes all the time. And so that also dictates, really what your job entails at any given time. And so that context, I think, is critical to this conversation. And then we've talked about this as well, tying this to really evaluations of your work helps highlight, okay, what does this person need to be good at? What, backgrounds, competencies, mindsets do they need to have in order to be able to do this work well? And then as you're looking internally, establishing leadership development priorities is really part of this. And, the reason that that's so critical is because it helps you understand, it sort of surfaces, okay, this one person on my team has this particular skill set. If they gain exposure to this other skill set, they could reasonably, over time step into this work. And then obviously we've highlighted diversity, equity, and inclusion training, largely because it helps folks be a little bit more candid about their personal biases and potentially reflect on, who they would favor for a given role, who they might overlook for in a given role, just given, their own mindset, their own biases. And so being a bit more candid about that helps too. Yeah, Adam, go ahead.
And I want to just kind of double click on this question about bias. I think that especially for y'all who are board members, this is a real thing in superintendent selection as well. This is obviously a real thing across, across all domains of our work, but often folks don't do the kind of like the bottom up analytical work of understanding what they really need in a role. And then they don't do the bottom up analytical work of understanding who within the organization maps to those skills and, interests. And so because they haven't done that work, when it comes down to selection, it becomes a lot about affinity. And so, you might feel affinity for somebody because they're like you. You might feel affinity for somebody because they remind you of, a past superintendent who succeeded, or they're sort of like out of central casting, so to speak, and they look like a superintendent looks, whatever it is. And this is part of the reason why our superintendency is so disproportionately male and white across the country, despite our students and our teaching profession being anything but disproportionately white and male. So this applies from the superintendent all the way down through the central office. And I found like the two best ways to confront it are, one, to force people to talk about their biases and to talk about bias and just to name it. Then secondly, and I think probably most effectively, to get people to stop thinking about the best person, or this person's great, this person's a rock star. Like if I hear somebody described as a rock star one more time, my head might explode. It's not about, there are no rock stars first and foremost, only Mick Jagger, but David Bowie's dead. So there's no more rock stars. So the thing is, it's not about people being great. It's about them being right for the role, which means you need to think about the role. You need to think about the skills, the experiences. Then you need to have a really disciplined process where you're comparing your internal folks to the skills and experiences and challenging yourself. Like, when you're building the list, like, is the list disproportionately, like you? For me, is it disproportionately, straight, white, male, etc.? And how can you look past that? I think that these conversations are a good example of when I say sort of the three legs of like the superintendent, the CIO, and HR or talent. I think each person would like to think that somebody else is owning this and making this happen, in part because we have different levels of discomfort with leading in this way. But fundamentally, the conversations don't happen with the right level of engagement and like consistency unless you make it part of the process in a very, very formal way. And the other thing I'd add, it's not just about diversity across lines of personal identity, which obviously is critical, but also thinking about people from within different branches of the organization at different, sort of different levels, so to speak. Often people, they say like their potential successors, they only name their direct reports. It could be that your direct reports are your most obvious successors, but just because they're your most obvious successors doesn't mean they're your only potential successors. There might be somebody awesome at a campus level. I don't know, it's possible. There could be all types of individuals where if you have a bottom up, like analytical process of saying, what does the job require and what skills do people have, you can surface folks who aren't just the people who already have a seat at the table.
Yeah, Chris, let's go to the next slide. Yeah, and we've said this before, the last and really most important element of succession planning is to assume that it will be gradual. And so what does that mean? One, that means, again, that you're having explicit conversations about the duration of your tenure, how long you intend to be in your job. And that doesn't have to mean that you're saying to your boss, okay, on May 31st, 2022, I'm leaving. That means, you're saying, I would like to be in this role for 3 to 5 years, 5 to 7 years, giving some sort of time frame so that you can focus the conversation specifically on your talent development needs. So, if you're looking at a 5-year time frame, that's a significant amount of time for the folks on your team to gain exposure to your work, and for you to cultivate your folks internally, bring someone on, bring an external person on, bring somebody on from another team on the district to enhance your pipeline. The second element of that is to identify specifically how you're going to delegate your responsibilities, hand them off over time so that it's not a sudden transition. Yeah. And so that's the last real step of succession planning. And so what we're going to do now is actually give you guys some time to think about, your succession plan. I know we have some executive advisors on the call. I would say for you, I would take this time to actually think about the districts that you work with, and your exposure specifically to the folks on your CIO, the CIO that you work with. How much do you have exposure to the folks on their team? So for example, Adam and I have talked about this a lot, how important it is to not just be working directly with the CIO, but with the people on their team, so that we're able to collaborate a little bit more directly on more granular work, and also have a feeling for the talent that exists outside of just the CIO. And so I think, if you're an EA and you don't fall into either of these two buckets, CIO equivalent or superintendent, I would think about it from your perspective. How can you push your CIO to make their work more sustainable? And a lot of that looks like actually your interactions with their team. So we'll take the rest of the time to actually begin developing plans. And Adam and I are here to answer questions, and help you think through anything as you're starting to write all of this out. But the goal today is for you all to leave with written answers to as many of these questions as you feel like you can answer today. And yeah, we're here if you have any questions.
As we're kind of digesting these questions, I'm wondering if anyone would be interested in coming off mute and sharing some of their thoughts and reflections on the succession planning so far. What feels like something you already have in place and you feel good about? Where might be some areas of challenge for you in your district? I guess I'm especially interested in some of the districts on the line, thinking about Longview, Seguin, some of the districts that have their first generation chief innovation officer in the role. How are you guys thinking about, setting up, thinking with the end in mind, as Adam and Freddie were saying, setting up the structure so when there is a succession necessary, then you guys have are in a good place. And feel free to type in the chat or come off mute.
Craig, I may put you on the spot since I know for sure that you're your district's first CIO. That's Dr. Coleman with Longview.
Superintendent Gutierrez, thank you for sharing in the chat. So you've only joined SGS in the last couple months or so, but you already have a chief innovation officer and a director of innovation. Maybe Adam and Freddie, if you can kind of zero in on best case scenario, what should a district be doing to set up these systems and structures with a brand new team and a brand new kind of body of work?
Yeah, I think, this is great to work with a concrete example. So I think in this instance where you already have, somebody directly reporting to a CIO, you have a CIO. I would say actually, go through the steps that Adam and I talked about. So number one, actually name the date every year when you and your HR director, your superintendent are going to sit down and have a conversation about if your CIO were to suddenly leave. For example, would your director of innovation would they be able to step into the CIO role? To use Adam's terms, do they have the skill and the will to do that? And if they were to do that specifically, what would that look like? What would they then be responsible for? One. And then two, the director of innovation, what would happen to their work? There are things, presumably that they're responsible for now. Oh, Chris, I thought you were talking to me. Who would then take on the director of innovation's work? So that's your emergency succession plan. And then two, the second big portion of this is a candid conversation between the superintendent and the CIO about how long they intend to stay in their job. What's the, span of years that they're thinking about right now, which raises the next question of how much time do you have to cultivate a pipeline, whether that looks like somebody you have on your staff now. Let's say the director of innovation is somebody, who would eventually be interested in stepping into the CIO role, and you think that they have the strengths to make that transition eventually. What needs to happen with that person, the director of innovation? What meetings do they need to be joining? What exposure to TEA specifically do they need to have, to your executive advisors, to whatever partners you have in the district? Who do they need to get to know? What systems do they need to be familiar with in order to be able to immediately engage with those systems as eventually CIO? And then separate from all of that, what skill sets do they need to cultivate? And so, I would say those are the two big conversations you need to be having for a district that has a CIO and that has a direct report. And then the second thing that I would say, let's say your director of innovation, and Adam and I have come across this, where somebody has a direct report who says, I'm not interested in getting promoted. That happens. Okay, so what do you do in that instance? Is there somebody else at the district who you should then bring onto your team? Is there an external hire that you need to make? And I think one assumption that we haven't actually made explicit is that the ideal in a gradual transition is that you are promoting somebody internally. You're trying basically as much as you can to avoid a sudden external hire. And, that's for a variety of reasons. Every district is nuanced, has their own unique circumstances and systems that somebody needs to be really familiar with in order to do their job well. And then separately, the CIO in particular needs to know all of the systems that they'll be engaging with, TA specifically, and they need to be familiar with the SGS work, because as we know, it's has many layers, and there's a lot really to get familiar with pretty quickly if you're the CIO. And so you're trying to avoid a sudden transition, and the thinking here is that you can avoid that by setting up a strong internal pipeline and keeping a sort of consistent gauge on that. So I hope that answers your question.
And Dr. Coleman, thank you for wanting to jump in. I changed the settings, so you should be able to come off mute now if you'd still like to share. Yeah, I think especially in the case of Lubbock, I was talking with Ken earlier today, the new Chief Innovation Officer in Lubbock ISD, taking on this role as the second in line after about 18 months of strong systems building, where Lubbock has taken the time to codify decisions, processes, and policies, is a much different story than were that not the case. So the second Chief Innovation Officer in Lubbock ISD won't need to be recreating a lot. We'll just be iterating and maintaining a lot of systems.
I can speak. I'm free. Thank you. One thing I wanted to add, just an idea for folks, and I totally agree. start with your comment. Like this work does intersect with the same core work of SGS really concretely. One thing that I've seen, and it's good timing in that SAISD just announced today how the district is dividing up Mohammed's work in his departure, and it's primarily between John and Dana, who were two of his key direct reports. And one of the ways that I saw them make a lot of progress, both on leadership development and also on the SGS strategy in general, was Mohammed delegating to like his key deputies to lead work within the district, sort of cross-functional alignment work. And so one thing you can do that's a bit of a twofer, both development work and also just sort of enshrining SGS work, is to get with your co-equal, like your chief academic officer, your chief financial officer, whatever it is, and establish kind of a point-to-point relationship where one of your team can work closely with one of their team, and you and the CFO or you and the CAO can sort of collectively like delegate the work and let them coordinate and plan cross-functional work within the district. On the one hand, you have an opportunity to give your folks like an at-bat to lead, but it's in an internal setting. And secondly, you give them an opportunity to build the sort of tighter relationships with, people the one layer deeper in the organization, which helps both for sustainability and also for breaking down the silos that might exist between like an innovation office and an academic office, or an innovation office and a finance office. Let's see. Oh, Dr. Watson, I don't know if you are off mute, but I'd love to hear your perspective. I see you put something in the chat.
Yes, I was going to share. So one of the things that we've done over the past couple of years in working with another partner, the Holsworth Center, is we've developed a leadership definition where we have really defined our pipelines for ready leaders to the principalship, as well as through departments. And so it really starts with the leader of self. That would be a teacher type position all the way to the leader of school, which is the principal. And then we've done that as well for central office, the leader of self versus the leader of the department to the superintendency. And so our teachers and principals and other central office leaders, we've developed what we call our leadership definition. It's on our website if anyone wants to look at it. And you can go through and click if you're a bus attendant and you would like to be the assistant superintendent, what are all the leadership attributes and things that you would need to work towards that. And then we actually work and grow people towards those. And so we have really frank conversations about where people are in terms of succession planning. This past year, we had a staff review for central office where I meet with each of the chiefs and their departments, and we talk specifically about the ROI of the individual. We talk about their roles in the job descriptions and opportunities for them to grow. They have conversations with them about where they would like to be within the organization. And we try to foster that so we can have those real conversations with them. And so we've just been on a 2-year journey with that. We're still at the beginning stages of it, but we're really trying to have a more transparent view that everyone is a leader, to really bring succession planning conversations to the forefront so we know who's interested in what positions. We give them experiences in those. And it's not a secret that, I would like to have that, but I don't want you to know that that's your position. And so we have those frank conversations for individuals that would like to be the superintendent one day, as well as individuals that would like to be the innovation officer position one day. And, Chris, you've seen we have different people that we experience, like Dr. Parasol and other assistant superintendents who have those skills. We expose them to that. We put them out front. That gives them opportunities to lead, but also be seen by our internal constituents as well as our board and our community.
That's awesome. We might want to do a case study about your work, honestly. I think that one of our districts is also with Holsworth, and so perhaps it's something we should talk to Holsworth about, because there are like good succession planning is good succession planning. It's nothing it's not a CIO sort of driven thing. And what you're describing, Dr. Watson, is your district has established a thoughtful organizational wide practice, and so it's that to me is that's the gold standard. I'd love to learn more about that offline.
Yeah, I think one thing that you raised, Dr. Watson, that I think is critical, that is really kind of part of this, is that you all give people the room to talk about their career aspirations, their ambitions. And what I would say about that is it's so critical, not only because it gives you insights into the kind of skill and will question, more importantly, it makes it more likely for people to stay in their jobs if they feel like their boss, the people that they work with, care about the ways in which they want to grow. And so my hunch is that your district probably has lower turnover among some of your key staff than you would otherwise have.
Well, we're working towards that. We've been in this journey for a couple of years, and so our goal is that we hope to see less turnover across the district.
Well, you're definitely doing the right things to reduce turnover. Absolutely.
Any other board members or superintendents or non-CIO folks who have a perspective to share?
Dr. Coleman, I'm going to try one more time. I just asked for you to come off mute. Trying to right my wrongs.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah, we get you. You're a little faint, but we can hear you.
You sound like you've fallen into the bottom of a well, and we're here to rescue you. I don't know. Listen. We're not able to hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah, go ahead. Just speak loudly.
Star, while Craig tries to fix his audio, by the way, Craig, not a rock star, but a musician, and I think a talented musician for what it's worth. Star, I'm curious. You've been deeply involved in SGS for a while, and also worked with districts across the country. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on, where you've seen folks fall short on this work within your client base over time.
I mean, I think this maybe two things stand out to me. One, Dr. Watson, I'm also just so excited to hear more about the work you all have been doing in spring, because I think it acknowledges the human aspect of this work, which is that, as you said so well, Freddie, people want to see where they can go, how they can grow and develop, what their next step is. We know that's important for our students. We spend a lot of time helping them look ahead to their futures and kind of think about where they're going and how their growth and learning will get them there. But I think sometimes with leadership transitions and succession planning, it can become a bit taboo or sensitive. And so I think giving safe space and room for those conversations in a way that doesn't feel like people are, watching their backs, but are instead in a growth mindset resonates. Easier said than done, for sure, but resonates. And then I just would underscore this idea that it's not a kind of one and done activity necessarily. And I think whether it's succession planning or codification of SGS work overall, the more that can be baked into the weekly routines that CIOs or their teams adopt, the less it ends up being something that kind of gets pushed aside. So I think there's some powerful ways that just like principals who are designing a new school through the New School Design Fellowship have kind of released time to focus on that design work. How can you as a CIO build into your weekly calendar the hour at the end of the week where you and your EA sit down and say, what are the 5 things we learned this week, and who's going to write them up, and where are we going to put them in that shared Google folder? I mean, it can be pretty simple codification work, but those are 2 things that I've seen that mitigate some of the challenges of keeping this on the front burner when there's so many other pressing demands.
I love that release time idea, Star. I feel like weekly is very ambitious. I appreciate your ambition. But I think that something, maybe it's monthly or bi-weekly. I feel like that's something we should probably try to make an official thing that everybody does. That's a really compelling idea.
One thing I would add to this too is that something that, we've observed that I think is true in a lot of districts is that a CIO often has work, far beyond SGS. They often wear a lot of different hats. And, outside of this particular work, something that we've observed in succession planning conversations is that, it's really important for people to have the opportunity to regularly say, this is the support that I need to be able to continue doing my job. And to put it more plainly, often people are doing more work than they're able to do over a long period of time. They're doing sprint level work over years, and that makes it more likely for people to leave their jobs. And so it sounds like a nice idea, something that's kind of a throwaway concept, but what we've observed is that, when you're thinking about your most talented people, your key staff, having this conversation is critical because it allows for them to stay in their job longer, really simply. They're able to make their job more manageable. And so, I think about a number of people who we've worked with who wear so many hats that it's a question of how are you going to keep doing all of this? And so taking, succession planning as an opportunity to say, how do we make this more manageable is critical, not just for the CIO or the CIO equivalent, but also for the folks who could use the professional development opportunities of taking on new responsibilities. So I think, we've made that point in a number of different ways, but I did want to put a point on, it's not just for the work itself, it's for the person who's in that job, being able to continue doing work that they enjoy doing, that they feel passionate about. Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for your time and engagement today. We're happy to be useful along the way, share tools and resources. Happy to do a call with anybody who would like to get a little more specific about how they could kickstart any of these practices. And for y'all at the superintendent or board side, that offer extends beyond the CIO. Succession planning is critical for the district in general.
Yeah, I've dropped my email address into the chat, and we're available for questions and thought partnership. This is something that we feel pretty strongly about in terms of making people's jobs and their work sustainable. So we're here as a resource.
Thanks all. A quick plug, we added a session with San Antonio ISD, which is served by Civic Solutions. Adam and his team, I've been working with San Antonio ISD for a while, and they're giving a quick presentation about their central office structures. So if you're interested and you have some time, please head over there. Thank you for your time today. Looking forward to seeing y'all around the event.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Watson. Thanks, Star. Thanks, Melissa and Michelle.